Every year, I took a holiday. I'd go to Florence. There's this cafe on the banks of the Arno. Every fine evening, I'd sit there and order a vodka and Mountain Dew. I had this fantasy that I would look across the tables and I'd see you there, scribbling your review of whatever reboot came after Christopher Nolan's trilogy. You wouldn't say anything to me, nor me to you. But we'd both know that you hadn't reviewed it, that you were happy. I never wanted you to review The Dark Knight Rises. I always knew there was nothing in that movie for you, but pain and tragedy.
The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. It's hard to believe it's been 3.5 years since The Dark Knight Rises was released in theaters, and it's appropriate to review it now as the story takes place 8 years after The Dark Knight, and it's already been that long now in reality. Like Nolan's other Batman movies, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, but not for the same reasons. Batman Begins opened my mind to the possibilities of real character depth and thought-provoking storytelling in a superhero movie. I was used to mostly formulaic action movies. Some of what had come before, especially Richard Donner's Superman, had captured my imagination, made me invested in his hero, inspired me personally and creatively. But I never expected that sort of a layered character study, a really competent crime drama, and a movie that so thoroughly explored an idea like Batman Begins did with fear and its relationship with conviction, the will to act. You didn't have to be a superhero fan to appreciate Batman Begins, and the same was true with its vastly more popular sequel. The Dark Knight subverted my expectations again in what a sequel could be, building on what came before with something totally unique that could easily be watched and appreciated on its own, and it was, as much as its predecessor, a movie that challenged me and made me think about the same ideas Begins explored, but on a whole new level, with the Joker's nihilistic philosophy that no matter our ideals, humans are simply a collection of chemical reactions that force us to do whatever we must to survive. The idea that Batman's refusal to give in to that philosophy, no matter how far he's pushed to break his one rule, and to make that the foundation of Batman and Joker's never-ending stalemate, was earth-shattering. In both cases, I had a deeply emotional and intellectually satisfying experience. I've never been able to put one film over the other as the best, although I'm still slightly more partial to Batman Begins and would still have to call it my favorite superhero movie if held at knife point. Okay, Joker, it's Batman Begins. I'm sorry I didn't pick your movie. No, I don't want to know how you got those scars. And yeah, despite this superhero movie renaissance we're experiencing, where at least 1 or 2 movies come out a year I feel I could write a whole dissertation on, Begins as a character study and as the definitive superhero origin movie still inches everything out for me, on personal preference, although I don't know if any superhero movie technically tells a better story than Captain America the Winter Soldier, but we'll get to that a little later in the year. I didn't have that experience with The Dark Knight Rises. My first viewing of this film was one of mild perplexity. It wasn't what I was expecting, in a lot of ways wasn't what I wanted, but that never stopped Nolan from totally winning me over before. As I mentioned in the Batman Begins review, he had a tendency to put things in trailers that looked counterintuitive, but that I completely came around on and fell in love with in the context of the movie. So I will admit that nothing in the trailers for this movie had me pumped. I was skeptical of the revolution angle, I was skeptical of how relentlessly heavy it looked, but I reserved judgment and didn't think much of it beyond a cursory, well, that's not what I was expecting, but it's Nolan, I'm sure it'll be amazing and keep me thinking about it for months. Well, I'll give it that second part. It has certainly kept me thinking about it for months, and now years. Constantly, to perhaps an unhealthy degree. I didn't have strong feelings about the movie while I was watching it, and was a little surprised by that. I wasn't angry that I didn't love it. I didn't think Nolan ruined the series, nor did I think, as I left the theater, that I had sat through another X3 or Spider-Man 3 or any number of terrible third parts and obligatory trilogies that were in fine shape until that nice, logically drawn straight line turned into an obtuse triangle. Dare I say I felt ambivalent watching a Christopher Nolan Batman movie. Heck, I've never felt ambivalent watching any live-action Batman movie. Bruce, this man I sympathized with, grew with through my college years, identified with, in some ways wanted to be, this man had given up. was ready to die, had lost everything that made him Batman, and was desperate to find himself again or give up the ghost. He had just been through this absolutely horrendous, nightmarish ordeal, rediscovered his will to live, climbed out of the pit, returned to his city, saved it from total annihilation, seemed to have maybe given his life for it, then turns out to have found a way to move on from the place his parents were killed, which he had given up everything for, and actually gets to have a life like he longed for in The Dark Knight. I see the bat go up in a mushroom cloud. I see a statue. I see a funeral. I see Alfred in misery, blaming himself for failing Bruce's parents and losing him in tragedy. And then I see the optimism, the hope, Bruce Wayne rewarded for all his pain and self-sacrifice, and Gotham rewarded with a new incarnation of Batman, the symbol of hope that never dies as long as someone is there to carry the mantle. People are moved. People are wiping tears from their faces. And I'm experiencing nothing. And as the days went by, I realized a lot of people had the same emotional experiences I had with the other two films with this one. And not just the general public. Friends of mine. People really immersed in comics and superheroes and Batman. And a lot of viewers responding to my first thoughts on the movie, vehemently angry with me for saying I was disappointed that it wasn't up to the same storytelling standards of the other two. Some people thought I had it out for this movie, that I refused to pay attention to what it was really doing and what it was really about, and I was nothing short of baffled by that response. I had seen a movie that looked great, had some good performances, had some thrilling action, had a gripping score, but a story that, especially for this series, struck me as a little by the numbers, and I hate to say, a little uninspired by the end. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, of course, and it didn't bother me that people weren't agreeing with me. It bothered me that so many people seemed to have that profound, meaningful experience I wanted to have. I wasn't going to lose my mind because Nolan had made a lackluster Batman movie, though. Third movies are hard. Endings, especially of a thing that traditionally doesn't have and kind of isn't supposed to have an ending, is super hard. This didn't become the Dark Knight trilogy until this movie. Nolan wasn't even totally committed after Dark Knight to doing another movie, and there was every possibility Batman driving off into the darkness, chased by the police, would be the last image we ever had of this version. And coming off the high of the unprecedented and unexpected success of a movie that made insane amounts of money, changed the face of superhero movies, action movies, crime movies, and has moviegoers and critics calling you a visionary, calling your film a masterpiece, calling your last movie, Inception, a masterpiece, and then being expected to do it again without letting that stature and reputation of artist and genius get to your head. Well, that sounds nigh impossible. And I have nothing but sympathy for Nolan in trying to tell a good story and not letting high expectations get the better of him. With the first two, he was just making movies. The expectations were high for The Dark Knight, sure, but only after he had decided what sort of story he was going to tell. Now he's expected to make another masterpiece. And worse, he can't make the movie he likely would have made if Heath Ledger were still alive. And Heath Ledger's death, unfortunately, is the reason that the Joker isn't mentioned anywhere in this movie. Despite his line about he and Batman doing this forever, looking at the whole thing as a piece, there are lots of ways to read that, I think, like the larger ideas represented by Batman and the Joker fighting for dominance eternally, or maybe the Joker and Blake's new Batman will do that same dance later, but I think it's safe to assume that line was meant more literally when written, and while I understand Nolan's not recasting the character and wanting to draw attention away from him, to not mention him at all when you set your next movie 8 years ahead is really distracting for an invested audience. I don't buy for a minute that that guy doesn't escape from prison in that time. But after seeing so many glowing reviews of Rises, and fans calling it the best in the series, and people trying to explain what they thought I wasn't seeing in it, I started to wonder, what if it's not the movie? What if it's me? I mean, I'm used to people disagreeing with me. I sometimes have the dissenting opinion. I like civil debate. I'm comfortable with reevaluating my convictions, but suddenly I found myself not just reconsidering my opinion, but second-guessing the very way I watch and critique things. Were my expectations too high? Did I have too many preconceptions about what a Nolan Batman movie was supposed to be, and I was incapable of taking this movie on its own terms? Had I turned into the sort of fanboy I always resisted becoming? I didn't want to be pretentious or prudish, but what if I had done this so long I was set in my ways and I couldn't recognize greatness because I was hung up on minutia? What if I was like Talia and Bane, unable to see the good in something because the world just wasn't what I wanted it to be? because I certainly had to make a lot of adjustments in seeing it a second time with as fresh a set of eyes as I could manage. A lot of choices felt contrary to what had come before, or at the very least, not where I would have expected things to naturally go from there, even jumping ahead 8 years, as if the mindsets of the filmmakers were so different from where they had been when they made Dark Knight, that they were interpreting their own work differently from what they had presented before. I wasn't sure I bought that Bruce stopped being Batman immediately after The Dark Knight, or Blake's "your hands are pretty filthy" line when Bane reads his letter about what really happened with Harvey Dent after The Dark Knight kinda won me over on Gordon and Batman's decision to let Batman take the fall for everything Dent did. And I didn't care for the notion that pretty much every adventure of note this Batman went on is on screen, and there's really no room to imagine others of Batman's famous rogues gallery going up against him. But, at least they got a football team named after him. Though I suppose we can imagine Blake taking them on past Bruce giving up the mantle. Some of that certainly is just my personal taste, and as I said, I was afraid I was letting what I hoped for cloud my appreciation for what was there. But on a second viewing, I left with more logical questions, felt the story was overall just as weak as I did the first time around, and it didn't elicit any more of an emotional response. But I still wasn't satisfied. This was Christopher Nolan on Batman. I had to be missing something. So I went on a quest to discover what I was missing. I refused to give up hope. I read the novelization, thinking I might have just missed some plot point that was perhaps not as explicit as it should have been. That didn't help. It also read like a pretty hurried first draft. I read things I liked by Greg Cox, but this wasn't one of them. It does have that one line about the Joker that probably would have satiated everybody about that if it had been in the movie, though. I read the script, and while it cleared a couple minor points up here and there, and it was interesting to see the slight deviations from page to performance, such as the congressman impatient about having to stand through Gordon's speech about Harvey Dent and his relief when Gordon decides not to read it, but it didn't clear up any of the baffling inconsistencies in internal logic, narrative cheats, or any contrivances that get Bruce from point A to point B. Simply put, I didn't think The Dark Knight Rises came together on a storytelling level, and every time I watch it, I hope against hope for a different experience. Sometimes I find myself latching onto an idea or a character thread more than I have before, and I think, this is it. This is the time I'm going to jump across the ledge and climb out of the pit. And by the third act, I always fall on the rope and end up back at the bottom of the hole. It's brilliant spectacle on a grand scale. The practical effects, vehicle, and set building are all astounding. What little CGI is here is as seamless and well integrated as I've ever seen, and Nolan is really pushing the envelope of what can be done inside the camera, especially with how much of the opening scene on the airplane is actually done with stuntmen in the sky and the full-size practical bat on top of a rig that's erased from the frame in post. He's innovating visually. It's made like the early epics of cinema. When Nolan calls for a crowd of several thousand people, he gets a real crowd that big, and that's never, ever done these days. And when he can't get as many people on screen as he wants, like in the football stadium, he spreads real people throughout and seamlessly adds more via green screen in between. It's movie making at its most creative, and behind the scenes features showing the level of care and detail that went into making every scene look as real as possible are absolutely inspiring. And it uses elements of two of my absolute favorite Batman stories, Nightfall and No Man's Land. And there's some Dark Knight Returns thrown in there for good measure, mostly just with the initial situation of a tired, grizzled Batman coming out of retirement. It had me nothing short of giddy to get to see Nolan's Gotham cut off from the outside world as the criminals take over with Batman missing. But we don't get to live there long enough or really experience that culture for very long. It introduces good ideas, but it doesn't go far enough with them, and I'm fuzzy on what it's getting at, if anything, a lot of the time. It has a terrifying, totally unique, seemingly psychologically complex foil for Batman and Bane, who loses all of that as soon as we get the big reveal at the end that Miranda Tate, who's actually Ra's al Ghul's daughter Talia, was behind everything. And neither of the reasons for concocting this elaborate scheme are developed or compelling. But the biggest reason I just can't bring myself to feel much watching this movie is that Bruce's hero's journey doesn't feel genuine. Despite everything he goes through, and a character arc about accepting loss, moving on, and finding yourself again that works great on paper, in execution, he never feels like he's really in danger to me, past the backbreak fight, which is out of context one of the single greatest fight scenes in any superhero movie, maybe any movie. Nearly everything Bruce accomplishes is spelled out for him by someone else, or else it feels like he's able to solve problems, especially in the climax, because he's read the script. This is the most confident, passionately made, incredible-looking movie I have ever seen, based on a script this inferior to its production. I want to believe in The Dark Knight Rises. There's still a part of me that has trouble accepting that I don't. Like Bruce at the beginning of the movie, I've had trouble letting go of the past and moving on. I know some of you won't like what I have to say here, and that's okay. As I said when I reviewed The Dark Knight, I can't possibly make everyone happy, and that's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to tell anyone to hate what they love, only to give you perhaps a different perspective from your own, and hopefully at least a slightly different perspective than one you've heard before. Because the internet dissected this thing with a fine-tooth comb 11 minutes after it was released. I always do these reviews well after the fact, but in internet time, I'm like 20 years late on this one. I'm only here to provide my honest opinion on the piece as a whole and my read on the story, and to finally get all my thoughts about this movie out on paper. I encourage you, as always, not to think just like me, but simply to think. My original opinion largely remains my opinion, despite my best efforts, and I don't like it either. But even if it means finishing this review with no subscribers, it's time for me to let the truth have its day. I've got to finally make the leap without the rope. As I said earlier, I was convinced after reviewing The Dark Knight that Batman and Gordon made the best choice they could given the situation. Batman takes the fall for what Dent's done in order to continue to inspire Gotham with a hero with a face. But here, there's a lot of questioning the morality of that decision without really getting into why it might have been so wrong. The way it's handled is really awkward, I think, because after all the talk about keeping Gotham together through a lie and Batman plunging his hands into the filth, the movie ends with Blake coming around on Gordon's speech about the rules becoming shackles, after he's not allowed to get kids across the bridge because of soldiers who are just following orders. We never get a sense, really, of whether Bruce actually regrets that decision, and Gordon's regret seems, I think, to be more about the personal shame of praising a man who threatened his child than it is about his thinking the city is being held together by a lie. By the end, nobody really pays for this mistake, if it's supposed to be a mistake at all, because Bane would have held the city regardless of that. He just gets lucky and happens to find the speech on Gordon in the sewer. Although there's something really unusual I like. Manhole covers are heavy. It's convenient that now he's armed with some sort of evidence that Gotham is being run by untrustworthy authority to fuel his fake revolution, but he's got a nuclear bomb. He doesn't really need that speech, and it ultimately has no bearing on what happens. But now is not the time for talking about Bane, that comes later. Beyond that, Bruce leaves Gotham with another lie, and even though it's a different sort of lie, that leads me to think, not having much else to go on, that he doesn't have the crisis of conscience about the Dent lie that Gordon has. And Gordon says he's resigning in his speech, but he's still the commissioner by the end of the movie. So this deception is played up like it's a crumbling foundation, but by the end, it makes no difference whatsoever, and as far as we can tell, the people of Gotham accept it and move on, just like I'm starting to think they might have done in the first place. I want to be fair about this. The problem may lie with the end of The Dark Knight more than it does with this movie. It might have been a hole Nolan and Goyer had a hard time writing themselves out of. The difficulty comes in portraying the city of Gotham as an abstract idea before it's a collective of individuals. The idea of a rotting city that needs a symbol of hope to inspire people to do the right thing can be believable, and it was and begins, but if you're not careful, it turns into a bunch of hypothetical nonsense. Gordon and Batman had already stamped out a lot of corruption by the end of The Dark Knight, and the Joker was apprehended. Batman says the Joker cannot win. Now, I think you can have your cake and eat it too on this the more I've thought about it. As I said when I reviewed The Dark Knight, I like Dent's name not being tarnished because the monster that killed those people wasn't really Dent. It was Two-Face. And that's not just about how he perceives his own identity or my read on it. It's about a more concrete psychological condition. Joker clearly drives Harvey Dent insane. He doesn't corrupt him with money or power, he corrupts his mind. I think a solid argument could be made that he wasn't responsible for anything he does after that. Now, certainly the Joker could make an argument from that proves his point that anybody would go insane if the Joker pushed him to that sort of madness, but I don't know that the public at large would respond the way we're acting like they would. So why don't Gordon and Batman tell the people of Gotham what really happened? I don't understand why it would necessarily stop the progress. Maybe the Dent Act would be called something else, but here we basically have a piece of legislation making it harder for criminals to use their connections to get out of jail because, in extreme cases, they're denied parole. Should the Dent Act be repealed just because of how it happened? It's not like anyone died to pass that legislation, nor is it condoning any evils. The thing itself seems to be helping, and the real problem seems to be just that, like there would be with any city. Everything isn't magically puppy dogs and rainbows for every poor or middle-class person just because there's not rampant street crime now. Maybe the point is the one I'm making, that they should have just told the truth in the first place. But what really are the consequences by the end if they're covering it up? I guess the idea is that Batman replaces Harvey as the hero to look up to, who sacrifices himself for the greater good. So maybe the city can move on because it still has that example. That seems ultra simplified to me, and I doubt that at the very least Gordon would be let off the hook if other people reacted to his lie initially like Blake did just because Batman saved them. So then Gordon's like, we'll chase him because he can take it, and Batman quits after a single evening. At first, I wasn't sure that's really what happened, but several people in the film confirm it. Daggett, when he says Batman was gone for 8 years and he had to pick today, and Gordon in the hospital room when he says, we were supposed to be in this together, and then you were gone. I like that the movie at least acknowledges that that's a surprising choice and that somebody in the movie is as taken aback by it as I was. But that seems overly simplistic and extreme to me. It's not like these movies have been about never having Batman in costume without our getting to see it. He was cleaning up the streets between Begins and Dark Knight. So why not just say he fought crime up until the Dent Act was passed? Isn't that the real thing? And I appreciate there's something tangible that made it so Batman was no longer needed. What, was it passed the day after Dent died? And at the very least, I'd figure Batman would feel the need, at least for a while, to make appearances so it didn't seem so suspicious, like it does here to Blake, that he kills a bunch of people and then just vanishes. That's sure what I thought the end of The Dark Knight was setting up. Also, everyone seems dumbed down so Gordon can have a dramatic moment and decide not to read a speech at the beginning. He says that maybe the time isn't right, and uses phrases like, maybe right now, all you need to know. And nobody finds that the least bit suspicious? Gee, sure sounds like he's hiding something. 8 years without organized crime and nobody has any healthy suspicion of their leaders, especially when they're talked down to like children? The Dark Knight Rises is building on ideas and themes the first two movies were exploring, and at the conceptual level, it's a logical direction and it's interesting. Batman Begins was an examination of fear. The Dark Knight was an examination of chaos, building on top of that, and The Dark Knight Rises is about the ostensible opposite of fear, which is hope. It's about how fine the line can be between fear and hope, and just as Begins demonstrated fear's positive qualities, how one can use his fear to motivate himself to do great and heroic things, Rises shows us how hope, generally thought of as an optimistic emotion, can be used to elicit despair. Bane is depicted as sadistic because he creates a false sense of hope, trying to make the people of Gotham believe they might survive, even promises survival when he plans to destroy the city no matter what happens. The dictionary defines hope as a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen, or archaically, a feeling of trust. Two popular conflicting aphorisms are don't give up hope and don't give their hopes up, like the two conflicting axioms about fear, have no fear and face your fears. Both are good things and both are bad things. Both emotions are complicated because, of course, human emotion in general is complex and difficult to quantify. They are simply concepts, our attempt to label something that is layered and nuanced. Bane's prison is considered the worst hell on earth because of how torturous it is to think you could get out, but knowing deep down there's no way. Your hope that you might be able to leave starts to feel a lot more like fear. If you could give up that hope and accept your predicament, you wouldn't be afraid of everything that comes with that terrible false hope. Sometimes giving up hope is a good thing. Accepting loss, like Bruce is unable to do with Rachel, and like he was unable to do at first when his parents died. He obviously has no hope of making a life with her because she's dead now, but that belief that they would have been together were she still alive prevents Bruce from accepting she's gone. And he's unable to accept that he can't single-handedly save the world, an idea he's becoming obsessed with since he sees no future for himself as Bruce Wayne. His arc is about letting go of denial, realizing his limitations, and instead embracing real hope and finding a way to move on. And interestingly, fear and hope go hand in hand here. When he relearns how to embrace his fear and let them drive him toward positive action in the pit, that translates to hope that he'll make the climb and that he can save his city. He rediscovers his hope not only for himself, but also for Batman, the symbol of hope for his city that idea was originally meant to be. In a lot of Batman continuities, Bruce is the facade and Batman is the real man, but Nolan's Bruce separates those personas, even though Rachel says Batman is his real face, and teases him with that infernal kiss. He says in that scene that Batman is just a symbol. In The Dark Knight, he allows it to change from a symbol of hope to a symbol of corruption in order to keep Harvey Dent's record clean and allow Dent to be the hero with a face. The question all along, alluded to by Rachel's letter at the end of The Dark Knight, is whether or not Bruce will ever be to a place where he can live without Batman. But Bruce is always Bruce, an intensely principled man who goes to extreme lengths to change the world, but a man who grows and changes and allows himself to think about what he wants, unlike the Arkham Universe Batman and the traditional comic book Batman, who refuses to change and thinks of himself as practically an immoral god who is above human limitation. This Bruce certainly pushes himself to the limit and doesn't want to believe there's anything he can't do, which gets him into trouble when he goes up against Bane, who is physically completely out of his league. Well, is in the league he used to be in, but you know what I mean. And arguably would have been even at his peak. But Bruce does hope, before Rachel's death, of a time when he doesn't have to be Batman, and that makes him really relatable. As I've said before, I really like both versions. The totally stubborn Batman who needs everything we all need but won't admit to it, and this one who dares to ask, when have I given enough? I think that's Christopher Nolan shining through the character. In a more grounded world, he can imagine a man who might be selfless enough to give his life for the greater good, like Foley does here when he gets over his cowardice finally and follows Batman's example, but not a man who doesn't want a life of his own. And I like that finding both his fear of death and his hope to live, Bruce realizes that he still wants something for himself, and suddenly saving Gotham isn't the vanity project it was before. The inherent dichotomy of the hero who puts the greater good above himself, but who will easily lose sight of what he's fighting for if he doesn't have a personal life of his own to keep things in perspective. Bruce never really had that, but he had the hope of it in The Dark Knight. And now that that's gone, we're seeing that lack of perspective play out, where, as Blake suggests, when he and Bruce first meet, he's looking too much at the big picture and he's lost sight of the people involved, the details that might need his help. At the beginning of the movie, he sort of turned Bruce into another Batman, or at least the way he's come to see Batman, an identity that exists solely to save the world. He can't be Batman because Gotham has no organized crime, and he can't be Bruce Wayne because he tried to use that persona to save the world with his Save the Town and Make It a Better Place machine. And he's terrified it'll fall into the wrong hands once Dr. Pavel publishes a paper. That was unintentional alliteration. This is Dark Knight Rises, not 60s Batman, explaining how a machine like that could be turned into a nuclear bomb. And so he's trapped and feels like he's failed on every level. And Gotham becomes, metaphorically, the sort of prison that Bane's is. No fear of death, no hope for the future. And so there's a certain logic to the idea that he needs to shed both identities by the end when he decides to fake his own death, both as Bruce and Batman. I don't know that I buy he could do that without anyone recognizing him, and I have no idea where he's getting the cash flow to go to Florence with Selina, along with a bazillion other questions concerning that ending that we'll get to later. But I like that this Bruce Wayne gets a happy ending, because in a lot of ways, he is the most human Batman of all, and if any version of Batman would have a true ending, it would be this one. It's sad at the start that he's living in a Gotham that seems to no longer need Batman, which was Rachel's proviso for their ever being together, but she's not around to enjoy it with him. But also, of course, still wouldn't have, because her still being alive would mean Harvey never went bad, because it's her murder that made it so easy for the Joker to push him over the edge. By the way, I would have given just about anything for her to get cast as yet a third actress in just the picture that's in Bruce's mansion. But the point of the ending isn't that the world no longer needs Batman, it's that it always needs that symbol, and it has to be a symbol without a face, because then it sets the example for everyone. And so in that sense, maybe it is saying that Batman was wrong for trying to be a symbol of anything but hope at the end of The Dark Knight. But I'm not sure about that. Harvey Dent might have created a culture of dependency around himself, the way Superman sometimes does, or Adam West's Batman, where he's setting a good example, but he's also thought of as the linchpin that holds everything together, and people rely too much on him to solve other problems. Batman has to be an idea rather than a person. You might be able to count on him, but he won't be there forever. So everyone has to do the right thing and be vigilant to ensure there's always a Batman. Every time Bruce puts the whole world on his own shoulders, the consequences of that are disastrous. His initial mission statement was to create a symbol to shake people out of apathy, not to solve everybody's problems for them. And it's interesting that he's described here by the woman who ends up being Talia al Ghul, no less, as someone who has a practiced apathy. He cares about the world, but he's given up setting that example. For 8 years, he's let Gotham go on without organized crime, but with other problems, namely economical, which he could have helped with if he hadn't run his company into the ground. Turns out, it's better to be a good person and go to the extreme when it's necessary rather than than going to the extreme all the time. In the end, he decides it's time to let Gotham take care of itself, while making sure that symbol continues on with Blake, and to finally concede that while he made himself more than just a man in the minds of his enemies and the people of Gotham, he is just a man, and trying to essentially create a utopia with the clean energy machine was a lot more about his own selfish needs than it was about the world at large. Now, I'm not saying clean, renewable energy wouldn't solve a lot of problems, but that particular machine was a quick fix in this case. I mean, where is Tony Stark when you need him? And Batman was supposed to be about changing people from the inside, not putting a nuclear band-aid on the world. Conversely, Bane and Talia, which I have to kind of lump together because Bane is essentially an extension of Talia by the end, are completely ruled by their emotions and are totally out of touch with their humanity. Bruce's character arc is about learning to fall and pick himself up again like he did in Begins, but Bane and Talia only know falling. They're obsessed with rising up, but they only know how to do that by dragging other people down. They talk about justice, but they're only about vengeance, not just on Batman, but on the whole world, for being the cruel place it is. Rather than doing what Bruce did when he walked away from the League of Shadows in favor of an admittedly more idealistic but more compassionate path and trying to make the world a better place, they take advantage of the teachings of the League and seek to punish the world rather than improve it. I wouldn't condone Raz's extreme the ends justify the means philosophy, but Bane and Talia's ends and means are both sadistic and horrifying. For Batman, after the character arc he has in Batman Begins, justice and vengeance are never the same. For Raz, they sometimes are. For Bane and Talia, they always are. If you live by the philosophy of Michael Clark Duncan's Kingpin, nobody's innocent, you can justify hurting anyone just for the sake of it by saying everyone deserves to go through whatever traumas you have because you didn't deserve them either. Or maybe you all deserve them. Batman believes people in general have it within themselves to do the right thing, like the people on the ferries proved to the Joker in The Dark Knight. But Bane and Talia believe people are naturally cruel. They experienced a world in the pit where people won't accept the kind of compassion Bane showed Talia, and so they show no mercy, and use, I think, the corruption Raz saw in Gotham as an excuse to make a whole city full of people experience despair the way they did, although I don't know if I really have enough to go on about either of them to read it that way. I feel like I can glean some of that from comparing them to Batman and the philosophy Raz taught all three of them, but what we really have here is a pretty standard and overly elaborate superhero movie revenge plot that I can read a little deeper into because of what came before, but which I still don't think there's nearly as much to as the movie wants me to think there is. But I do really like contrasting Bane and Batman's personas, even if it's all a lot less interesting by the third act. They both are symbols of hope, and as I said, one represents real hope and the other represents a hope that's all about elongating despair. Batman's mask is meant to strike terror into his enemies, but there's clearly a human man inside, and if he lets you see it clearly, he can show you the entire gambit of human emotions with his eyes and mouth. Bane has less of his face covered, but no matter what he does with his eyes, which convey an incredible amount of different emotions and with wonderful intensity from Tom Hardy, he always has that monster baboon mouth that makes him look constantly angry. Batman has a utility belt, relies on gadgets. Bane's just a behemoth. He'd be scary enough without all the ninja skills, but he's Batman with a strong man's physique. Batman doesn't use guns because he has a moral aversion to them. Bane doesn't use guns because, to paraphrase the Huntress from Birds of Prey, he is the weapon. Batman's voice is a deep animalistic growl, which he uses to intimidate his enemies, whereas Bane's voice is sickeningly sweet, a voice that tauntingly says, "Everything will be fine," while everything else about him says you'll never make it out of here alive. I love Hardy's unconventional choice of tone and cadence. Every phrase ends in a positive upswing, and he takes such joy in everything he's doing. Since we're there, both voices are unintentionally funny sometimes and really make fun of him. But after the initial shock of how goofy it sounds wore off the first time I saw it, and once I saw it in a theater with a decent speaker system and realized it was a lot clearer than I'd thought initially, and came to genuinely love the juxtaposition with the look, the sound of Bane's voice perfectly reflects what he's all about. He's a lot scarier because of that creepily soothing, faintly mechanical voice. He sounds like Mario if he was a psychotic mercenary that had a respirator attached to his face. Imagine that voice in Mario 64. "It's me, Mario. Press start to play." He's not the most compelling villain in a superhero movie, but he's certainly one of the most original in look and in performance. Everything he says is memorable and quotable. That happened with the Joker to an extent, but with Bane, it's like every line. I suspect the Joker's popularity had something to do with that, where people expected another villain they'd want to dress up as and quote constantly, and I don't know if that influenced more the way he was written or the way people reacted to him, but I've heard everything he says quoted somewhere. It's crazy all the context some of those lines work well in. Do you mind if I play you this Britney Spears song? It will be extremely painful. For you. Bane is terrifying. I can't imagine anything more frightening than holding on to that guy for dear life coming out of a plane fuselage after he's just taken a lot of your blood, put it in another guy to fake your death, and told you, now is not the time for fear. That comes later. No, the time for fear is all the way up until that happens. Bane is the true anti-Batman. Ra's was Batman's opposite in his ideology on justice. The Joker was Batman's opposite in that he didn't even believe in justice, but Bane is Batman with all the training, all the pain, but none of the nurturing and guidance. In the DVD special features, Christopher Nolan talks about Bane as an opportunity to finally give Bruce a physically superior antagonist, and I think that was a smart choice for a Batman who's past his prime. After everything he's been through, it's neat to see him come up against something else he's not remotely ready for. In The Dark Knight, Bruce oversimplified criminals, thought they were all basically the same, and nearly met his match with the Joker. Here, he thinks he can beat Bane with sheer willpower and training, but like the Joker, Bane is someone who can't be intimidated because he's not afraid to die. Bruce isn't either, but he's also lacking in conviction, whereas Bane, opposite from the Joker, is a guy with a plan. All that matters is the plan. He's willing to die for his cause, and Batman's just ready to die. Until I realize what's really going on and it all kinda unravels, I'm loving all of this. Bane is what Batman used to be. Driven, committed, a terrifying symbol who seems to be more than a man, and Bruce is just a man without purpose now, running around in a batsuit. But Bane is also Batman's opposite in that he never truly learned to face his fear and work through his pain like Bruce did. His mask represents that idea, holding the pain at bay, while Bruce wears his pain and his fear right up to his skin. It's also interesting to look at Batman and Bane's sense of identity. As I said, there's a total separation between this Bruce and Batman. He fully transforms when he's in the Batsuit to the point where he even talks to himself with that voice, unlike, say, the Batman the Animated Series Batman, who will talk in his real, lower Batman voice in and out of costume until he's putting on the Bruce Wayne act. Bane has no alter ego. He's just Bane. Like the Joker, he's this extreme idea, almost a force of nature all the time. Of course, we never knew how the Joker got that way, and Bane's backstory, such as it is told to us. With the Joker, perhaps his scars set him on the path to become that walking personification of chaos, like Bane's permanent mask led him to become this walking personification of false hope. They're both people who don't have the luxury of an alias, although Joker does like to wear disguises despite his scars. Also, like the Joker, he sees what he does as some sort of calling, or at least he says he does. It's hard to tell how much of what he says he believes, or how much of it is him talking for Talia, or how much of it is him just saying things. The Joker calls himself an agent of chaos, while Bane calls himself necessary evil. In the same way the Joker says he just does things, I'd almost like to see Bane toward the end say he just says things. Selina Kyle is a sort of midpoint between Batman and Bane. She has a singular identity like Bane too, but pretends to be someone else like Batman. While there's never any difference in her own head about who she is, she's able to become virtually anyone she needs to be for any situation, capable of sizing someone up and telling what sort of emotional mask to wear to get what she wants out of them. She doesn't have the sorts of insecurities driving her that Batman and Bane do. She's like an empathic metamorph. Bruce can't move on, Bane won't move on, but Selina is desperate to. She's a criminal, but thinks she's stealing for the right reasons. In her mind, a hero who works outside the law, like Batman, still fighting what she sees as corruption, while Bruce sees an uncorrupt Gotham that doesn't need him. She straddles that fence between the good and the bad, sort of like your standard comic book Catwoman, except she's a little bit more of a Robin Hood type. But rather than trying to fix the big picture like Batman, or blow it up like Bane, Selina actually looks at the individuals. She has a skewed view of things like Bruce does, and they have parallel character arcs about discovering what the the world would really be like if it was the way they thought it should be. People are still suffering in Gotham without the corruption Batman stamped out, and there aren't enough people fighting regular everyday injustices. And when Selina gets her wish of a Gotham where the rich become poor and everyone's equal, the 1% becomes the 1. Well, 2, but she doesn't know that, as Bane has all the power and the people have none. And John Blake, the good John, we've got a good John and a not-so-good John in this movie, is the hero with a face who learns to become the idea, or at least that he doesn't see enough justice in the system and that he should probably put on a mask if he's going to fight crime outside the law to protect the people he cares about. You know, whoever they are. I guess orphans? And the villain from the first episode of Birds of Prey who runs the orphanage? Oh, and the mayor is moonlighting now as the sheriff in Bates Motel. And when did that advisor guy from 24 become president? And why is Teal'c working for Bane? Anyway, some of what happens to Blake strikes me as a little neatly timed to set him up as the next Batman, like his developing an aversion to guns. But I like the acknowledgement of the different sorts of takes on Batman with his character. There's some real detective work in this movie that's not done with just fancy state-of-the-art equipment, and sadly, Blake uses his own head, and we get into his head a lot more than we do Bruce's. But I like that at the end, when he is clearly set up to become Batman, he's becoming the detective Batman over the ninja Batman. I don't buy Blake's ability to meet Bruce once and know he's Batman, no matter how similar their experience of loss is and the look on Bruce's face he practiced in the mirror every day. Honestly, in Gotham, that look can't be that rare. That's one of those narrative cheats, I think, to save time. Blake knows Bruce is Batman, move on. But that scene is trying so hard to feel believable, and I'm sorry, it reads like really lazy writing. I could see Blake maybe putting 2 and 2 together eventually, the tragic backstory and the emotional mask Bruce seems to wear with his vast resources, and then maybe he'd, you know, investigate? Wouldn't it be neat if Blake became a cop and was working toward detective, inspired by Batman, and because he had investigated Batman and figured him out? And that scene wouldn't have to be much longer. We wouldn't really even have to see it happen. He could just say, I thought you might be Batman, then I started digging and I figured it out. Other people have figured it out, like Reese in The Dark Knight. This is supposed to be a grounded, more realistic world, right? Where it would be much harder to hide your identity than it is in the comic books. And yes, I'm in the camp that thinks Blake's real first name being Robin is pandering to an audience that really wanted to see a Robin in these movies. Nolan isn't above the heavy-handed and the sap, but that's going pretty far, although maybe not for this movie over the other two. I know some people really like that and see it as a bone they threw to Robin fans. That was a groaner for me. I really appreciated the subtlety of, you know, this guy is kind of like a Nolan-verse version of Robin, but I really resisted blatantly spelling it out like that. Some people have argued with me on it, saying that I picked up on that subtlety because I'm a Batman fan and other viewers might not, but A, the general public is familiar with the notion of Batman having a younger sidekick and a young kid or young adult figuring out he's Batman and joining up, and B, even if people don't pick up on it, it's not necessary to understanding what's going on. Maybe it's a thing a person would notice on a third or fourth viewing, and that would be awesome. That's called subtext, Steven. It's impossible to talk about this movie without bringing up the rich versus poor backdrop and the characters like Selina and the people at the stock exchange who criticize America's current capitalistic system that seems to keep the rich richer and oppress the poor. Those issues were extremely topical and remain so as this movie was being made. Occupy Wall Street happened just after this movie was filmed. I find it a little baffling that Nolan says in an introduction that serves as the foreword to the Dark Knight trilogy script book that no messages of topical issues were intended in the Dark Knight and that people read too far into that movie. And this was right before Rises was released, so he says he can only imagine how people will read into this. He calls his Batman world an alternate universe, as if because the players aren't the same, he's not commenting on those issues. But it's impossible not to try to figure out if the movie is saying anything about those things, because especially in this movie, they serve as major motivators for our characters. And I'm not complaining about that. You certainly risk coming off agenda-driven when you release a Batman movie in 2012 that has your terrorist, revolutionary bad guy attacking a stock exchange of all places, as much or more so as you did when you released a Batman movie in 2008 that dealt with the morality of wiretapping. But this is supposed to be a grounded rather than a stylized universe, and it makes sense that the politics of the time would inform your story. And a little thoughtful social commentary never hurt anybody. Maybe I become desensitized to this because, partially thanks to Nolan's movies, the superhero genre on the whole is really politically charged these days, and I can't talk about a Marvel movie without getting into government government surveillance and the role of authority on the private sector and corporate greed, and the list goes on and on. The trick is not to be preachy. In this case, both sides of the 1% versus everybody else issue are sort of given their day, and we're sort of allowed to make up our own minds by the end. Yes, Selina is seeing real unfairness as the rich are taking advantage of their stature at the expense of the middle and lower class, and the idea that there's still institutionalized corruption beyond the mob takedown that Bruce wouldn't even think about because he grew up with it and he's a part of it, even if he doesn't mean to be, is interesting, and something I wish the movie had done more with. Selina has a more complex view of all this by the end, but I don't think it's the movie saying the status quo is fine, and corporate greed doesn't hurt opportunities for or see the higher class mistreating the lower class. By the end, she sees a man in Bruce Wayne who really does care more about people than he does about his own money. And having been so desperate to survive, she turned on him and led him to a trap for Bane. She learns from his example and becomes a little more selfless from one of those 1%ers, even if it was after Bruce lost all his money. And of course, she doesn't totally change. She's still cool with guns and killing when the need arises, but that's lucky for Bruce since Selina takes out Bane for him, and it'd be hard for him to fight with that huge knife wound Talia just gave him that seems to totally disappear right after that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The city is saved from a madman who pretends to lead a revolution against Gotham's corrupt, rich oppressors by one of those former said rich people who couldn't have done it without resources like an EMP and a super fast-moving Batcopter plane thing that averted nuclear disaster. So it's obviously not an anti-big business PSA, especially since one of the reasons people in Gotham aren't better off is decisively because Wayne Enterprises isn't making any money. But I don't think it's letting underhanded business off the hook either, given the corruption that wends its way back into the city with John Daggett, because I guess Roland sounded too much like Nolan or something. The infuriating thing is that apart from giving Selina a motivation and creating a status quo for Gotham that doesn't look totally peachy after Dent's death, the notion of Gotham's corruption beyond the mobs is used largely as an excuse for Bane to make up a revolution, and it's a huge missed opportunity. None of his speeches about rich oppression or peace achieved through a lie really make a difference because everyone's forced to live under his new regime regardless of what they think about that. Not only is it not an actual revolution, but Bane doesn't really inspire anyone to rise up, or if he does, we don't see that happen. Sure, regular citizens become part of his new system, but that doesn't necessarily say anything beyond they're scared and they're doing what they think they have to survive. I always want to complain that there's no reason anyone would believe Bane when he says the speech he reads on the steps is Jim Gordon's. But then they're all being held in the city under threat of a nuclear bomb. It doesn't matter if they believe him or not. They don't necessarily help release the Blackgate prisoners, if any regular citizen was even involved in that, or do anything based on anything he says beyond he's the guy with the bomb. It would sure be interesting to see Bane get a lot of followers through something that looks like an actual revolution, prey on the hopeless who don't think they can ever achieve what they want because of empty, as Bane calls them, promises of opportunity. I mean, I love the idea of comparing what Bane is doing to a system that favors the rich but claims to be fair for everyone. An argument could be made that it's the social version of seeing the clouds but not being able to rise up out of the pit. This movie feels like it's going to really get at the heart of those issues, but then nothing Bane says really means anything. And I mean, yeah, I know that from the beginning when he tells Bruce he's going to poison Gotham with hope, but I still figured we'd see some people buying what he's selling, talk about some of those ideas. Bane could have made the revolution about anything, and no matter how ridiculous it was, the people would have to go with it because they didn't want to get blown to hell. The bakery's donuts are too expensive. The pastries are yours. There's too much black and yellow stuff in Gotham. None shall interfere, but start by painting that stadium in less depressing colors. At the very least, we should have spent more time with citizens during the No Man's Land and gotten opinions about Bane's new order beyond the cops, Selina, and her almost totally non-present sidekick. Unfortunately, and this is why a lot of my read on this movie is more inherent to the concepts, visuals, and basic skeleton of the film, there are a lot of things I feel like characters should be talking about that they're not. And a lot of characters make choices to get us to the next plot point rather than really feeling like actual people making decisions in the moment. Folks I used to think I understood are doing weird things that don't really make a lot of sense. Characters can make foolish decisions, but they have to learn from them, or else there have to be consequences and some reason they refuse to learn from them. Lucius Fox has consolidated all the subsidiaries of applied sciences under one roof, he says, to keep them out of the wrong hands. What kind of logic is that? Put all the dangerous prototypes in one place so if somebody found that, happens, they have your entire armory gratefully accepted? That one's maybe not a huge deal comparatively. I'm pretty sure it was all in the same place in the previous two movies also, but that logic struck me as odd, and really just there so Bane can steal it all, and so we know he has everything. And the popular gripe that Gordon sends all the cops into the sewers just so they can get trapped and Bane has an easier time getting a grip on the city. I mean, yeah, all the cops got trapped on one island, so Gordon would be on his own in Begins, but that would be the main reason I would figure he wouldn't make that mistake. How it should have ended postulated that maybe he was on so many painkillers in the hospital he was delirious when he said that. I like that theory. I'm gonna go with that. Also, if I were Gordon, I'd be absolutely mortified of hospitals. But anyway, my main gripe here is that I'm just not in Bruce's head enough. It's clear he's changed his mind about what the point of Batman is, and that's why he doesn't have to keep being Batman or Bruce Wayne. That one I think is pretty clear without the necessity of a lot of conversation. Blake telling him to pay attention to the details, Bane's plan both reminding him that there are people who need a symbol of hope even when things are okay on paper. What I'm fuzzy on is what exactly he sees his failure as. Does he blame himself for not continuing as Batman for those 8 years? Gordon tells him in the hospital, "I thought we were in this together," and he responds with, "Batman wasn't needed anymore," which Gordon doesn't seem satisfied with. I don't think that would have stopped Bane and Talia from coming. From their perspective, Gotham would be well past the point of corruption the League of Shadows would step in for, and there would be lots of other cities they're going after, but apparently they're misunderstanding Ra's al Ghul's destiny as Gotham's destruction, and it's too corrupt to be saved no matter what. That place could look like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and they'd be all, "The fire rises!" Bruce beginning to realize people need his help doesn't break him out of his death wish before he's sent to the pit, so it can't just be that. If he had continued as Batman, he might be more ready for Bane, so there's that. I suppose it might be as simple as he failed in not defeating Bane in the first place. But I think Bane's talking about more than that. Like, Gotham is still corrupt, he couldn't save it, and Bane is bringing the same justice Ra's was, except he's going to make it hurt worse because Bruce betrayed the League and killed Talia's father. And I think Bruce feels guilty about more than that, but the only clue we really get is the Ra's al Ghul hallucination, when Ra's, so his brain then, says that all he's accomplished is a lie. Does Bruce wish he'd handled Harvey's death and the cover-up differently, or is he hating himself for not saving Harvey? It's hard to believe he's changed his mind about taking the fall for Dent, considering he leaves Gotham through another lie. This one's different. It's not pretending like a murderer is the shining example of justice, but it is putting Batman on a pedestal for a sacrifice he didn't really make, just so he could run off with Catwoman and fulfill Alfred's fantasy. Maybe Bruce has come to think he should have walked away from Batman after he stopped Ra's and Begins. He wouldn't have inspired Harvey, and they wouldn't have brought down so much organized crime, but you also wouldn't have had the Joker. Maybe he even wishes he could go back and save Ra's on the train, since I don't think the Batman tempted to break his one rule in The Dark Knight would have made that decision. And if Ra's were still alive, Bane wouldn't be taking over now. And there isn't the talk about responsibility there was in the other two movies, and that's tough. He doesn't have Alfred to talk to after their confrontation toward the beginning, but I don't know, he could maybe talk through some of it with Lucius. Although his self-discovery really happens in the pit, and it would be ridiculous if he took the time to talk all that stuff out when he only had a few hours left to deal with the bomb when he got back to the city. I feel very distanced from Bruce through a lot of the movie, and that makes it harder for me to appreciate what he goes through. What makes it even harder to appreciate, though, is my complete lack of suspension of disbelief, both in how difficult everything is supposed to be for Bruce and a lot of the choices he makes by the end. A lot of people complain about the magic knee brace, and how quickly Bruce comes back from his back break, and that he gets back into Gotham with no resistance, and we don't see that happen. The reason a lot of us reacted to those things was because all the tension is deflated when we can't feel the protagonist's grueling journey with him. Yes, what he goes through is hard, but even though he's proactive, I feel like he's being dragged through his own story. Bruce gets his back broken by Bane, and there I'm absolutely with him, feeling every punch, every kick, every crack of his Batman mask. I love that Bane's hideout is laid out like a huge arena, and the choice to drop the music out and allow the scene to be scored by the blows in the running water is fantastic. I also like, come to think of it, that Bane has what's akin to his own Batcave there. Parallel symbols of the personal hells both men live in, and their attempts at rising up out of them to impose their respective brands of hope on Gotham. But then in the pit, the man hired to keep Bruce alive pushes his vertebrae back in, and he has to hang there until he can stand. I have a hard time buying it would heal that fast, but even though this is a grounded universe, it's still heightened to a degree, and a little of that comic book logic is okay if it's consistent. There's certainly some of that in Begins in Dark Knight, especially Batman taking long falls and not breaking anything. I'm not a stickler for realism, but I am a stickler for believability, and after this is when I start getting taken out. Bruce tries the climb and he falls, dropping hard on his back on that rope. Really? After what Bane did to his back, that doesn't throw it all kinds of out of whack? And then he tries it again, and the way he drops, because he slips this time, is even more violent and more painful, and he's still able to walk? And then he's told exactly what he has to do in order to psych himself out into being able to make the climb. Sure, only Talia was able to do it before, so he still has incredible skill to be able to make the jump. But I don't like that everything's handed to him in this movie, especially with the rich versus poor motif looming. I'm even okay with the old prison doctor telling him he needs to find the fear of death again, but does that guy have to spell things out all the way to jump without the rope? Can't we let Bruce come up with anything on his own? And this is minor, but how is it he tries to climb with all that constant chanting twice, and he's seen other people try to climb in the interim before he finally asks what the chanting means? Oh, because he's about to rise, and that's in the title, and it's the big moment where that finally happens. So now I'm starting to feel like I'm being played for a sap. And then Bruce comes out of nowhere in Gotham and starts talking to Selina. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Don't say we need to see him get back into Gotham. We know how he got in. Pay attention. He used the bat. Okay, fine. I agree with you. After several viewings, I'm sure that's how he got back in. Still doesn't make a lot of sense to me, though. First off, this is your classic hero descending and rising out of hell story. Bruce takes a horrifying trip to the underworld and returns stronger and braver than before, ready to take what he's learned to benefit his homeland. Bruce is given clear, seemingly implacable obstacles to overcome. The biggest, it seems, when it's introduced, is that he's exiled and totally cut off from his city. And we generally expect to live with our hero as he overcomes adversity. Here, we don't even see it. It's not even a challenge. He somehow got back to Gotham with a day to spare, and whatever, he's Batman, he's resourceful. I just wish I saw how he did it, because it's probably the most impressive thing he does in the movie, and something that comes from his own brain. The big issue I have with this, beyond it's just not very gratifying, is I don't buy that he'd risk it. Sure, the bat is relatively quiet for a flying machine with propellers under it, but the challenge I expected him to have to deal with is that the bomb is supposed to be detonated if anyone attempts to get inside the city. It's why the government can't do anything about this situation. Perhaps Bruce can take Bane at his word that no matter where Bruce is, Bane isn't going to allow him to die until Gotham is ashes, but Bane certainly isn't expecting Bruce to escape. How does Bruce know Bane won't panic and detonate the bomb as soon as he sees the bat? How does Bruce know that whoever's holding the trigger isn't going to push the button if they see anything land from outside? That strikes me as an awful big risk. And then he just keeps making really dangerous assumptions and is always right because it's his movie. He apparently takes the time to have a shower and change and then tells Selina that bomb's going off tomorrow. Turns out that's true. But how does he know that for sure? He had the news feed in the prison, but Bane didn't say at the stadium how long the bomb had before it went off. It's also weird that in his anger, he throws a rock at the TV. You'd think he'd want to be armed with as much information as he could possibly have before he goes back. Bane doesn't even tell anyone in Gotham it's a time bomb, so he can keep them thinking he'll keep Gotham cut off with the bomb forever. We're not told this, but it's maybe a safe bet that Bruce has a pretty good idea how long the reactor has before it completely decays and explodes, because he would have done some research after he read Pavel's paper, or maybe that was even in the paper. Bane knows how long they have through his own calculations. Now, I'd buy it if Bruce had help from Mr. Lau. That guy is great with calculations. But here's the thing. Even if Bruce knew down to the second how long he had before the bomb went off, and he doesn't, because he asks Lucius when it's going to go off when he sees him, and Lucius says 12 hours. But he has no idea when exactly Bane got to the reactor. It would be reasonable for him to guess it happened shortly before Bane went to the football stadium. But he couldn't know if it was hours before, or a day, or even 2 days before. So Bruce risks somebody spotting his bat getting back into Gotham. He's less than a day away from the bomb going off, so he's just lucky he got back in time. He doesn't have the sense of urgency you'd think he'd have not knowing how many hours he had, and he's just assuming he has enough time to change clothes and make a big fiery bat sign to bring hope back to the people, which he also can't know wouldn't make Bane trigger the bomb. And he and Lucius work up a way to disarm the trigger because Bruce is concerned if he makes a play for the bomb, they'll trigger it. So he knows that's a danger, but he's making way too many assumptions about what would make Bane decide to set the bomb off. Then we get to the end, and you've got your standard time bomb countdown, get rid of it in the nick of time scene. And it's also, by the way, ridiculous that anybody can pinpoint it down to the second when that reactor is going to decay enough it explodes. And Batman gets stabbed by Talia. He's talking like Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, and looks like he could be bad enough he's bleeding internally. Then he gets over that real quick like he's Wolverine, and with only 2 minutes to get rid of a nuclear bomb with a 6-mile blast radius, he takes the time to not so cryptically tell Gordon he's Batman and make out with Catwoman. I can kind of see where Nolan's coming from when he says in interviews that he thought he owed it to the audience to finally give us a big, spectacular comic book-esque finish, and he's been kind of promising that if we ever got to an end. But you've still got to have internal logic. You have to build to that gradually and fit it into the world you've created, and there's just way too many conveniences and assumptions made for me to believe anything I'm watching at the end. And again, Bruce doesn't really do anything inventive or do anything unique to his personality. He's relied on gadgets before, but he's often used them in creative ways that spoke to who he is. Here, it's played up that he fixed an autopilot, and that's somehow or rather how he survives in the end. Once again, it's a thing he does off screen, so it feels like a plot device. I guess he takes what he learned about Bane's mask and is oh so clever in hitting him in the face repeatedly on the fight of the steps, but that's not ingenuity, that's just common sense. And common sense he should have had the first time he fought Bane, considering the CIA guy in the airplane guessed Bane needed the mask to survive. So Bruce basically has to go to a hellish prison so someone can tell him to hit the big Z on the putty patrollers. Then something happens that is so gimmicky and so primetime TV drama I couldn't even believe what I was watching. And as I said, I gave this movie the benefit of the doubt and tried to figure out what I was missing. But this is as much of an editing sheet today as it was in 2012. We see Batman in the cockpit, with the sunlight clearly passing through it so we know he's inside the bat and moving. 5 seconds before the bomb goes off. It's cut to make us think we're seeing him right before that explosion. But he would have had to eject way before that so he wasn't caught in the blast radius. And of course, it's a neutron bomb, which would expel a whole lot of radiation, so it's impossible to believe thousands of people wouldn't die anyway. But especially being the person delivering the payload, if we just take the movie's logic that as long as you're 6 miles away, you're fine no matter what, never mind what would actually probably happen in real life, he needed to eject a lot earlier than the movie makes us think he does. So all I can figure is the scene is cheating and we're seeing Batman give a look like his time is up just to get a rise out of the audience, and what we're seeing actually already happened several seconds ago. A radical theory went around right after the movie came out, and I don't know if anyone still subscribes to this, that Batman maybe really does die, and when Alfred sees him at the end in the cafe, that's maybe just a fantasy, and it was likened to Nolan's previous movie, Inception, as potentially an ambiguous ending. And there's a big clue, of course, that the ending of Inception is not as ambiguous as people were initially led to believe. But if that were the case, what's with all the talk about the autopilot? That's set up really early and played as a clever payoff at the end, which, with Batman lying to both Lucius and Selina about it, honestly seeming a little more concerned about his bright new future than he is with making sure Gotham doesn't explode. But see, that's why I can't feel anything watching this movie. It feels like he already knows what's going to happen before it happens. So now on to the big reveal at the end with Talia. I have never seen anything like this. The movie presents this fascinating villain in Bane. He's like nothing I've ever seen before. He's giving all these big speeches and I'm trying to figure him out, which is fun. From the moment he says, "No one cared who I was before I put on the mask," I immediately started drawing parallels to Bruce, who he is in and out of the mask, ready to compare their ideologies and worldviews. And then we're given this potentially interesting version of the backstory where Bane is Ra's al Ghul's son and heir, who was born in this prison, escaped, was trained by Ra's, and was too extreme for the League, so he was excommunicated. So now you've got this whole new layer to Raz's background, where Bruce was supposed to replace the biological son Ra's felt forced to cast out, and Bruce is his big chance to fill that void. And he ended up replacing an extreme monster with an idealist who won't do all that is necessary. That's not at all what I was expecting. It's a total departure from the comics, but with still some of the meat of Bane's origin intact, and my imagination started to run away with itself. Then we get to the end, and the big twist is way less interesting than the false backstory. I suppose it's all still kind of the same, except replace Bane with Talia, and Roz didn't have to excommunicate his heir. Honestly, I'm wondering where Talia was while Bruce was there. And again, maybe Bane is just speaking for Talia, so you put them together and you have kind of one character. But besides having a mole at Wayne Enterprises the whole time and creating a sort of false hope for Bruce in Miranda Tate, who not only preaches optimism and tries to get him back in the world, but sleeps with him after he loses his fortune, it seems like a twist for the sake of a twist and to try to cleverly book in the trilogy with a big surprise look, this character is really this character in the third act. It watches to me like I'm supposed to feel more satisfied by this now completed background because there's a Talia here and that's a comic book thing. But I don't necessarily expect that with these movies, and the uninitiated won't be impressed that you gave Roz a daughter. I'm not saying it isn't seeded. There are plenty of clues, and some of those I really like, such as Talia telling Bruce she'll take care of his parents' legacy, and especially suffering builds character. I also don't think it's any more or less callable than the Ducard-Roz reveal in Batman Begins, but that one brought an extra dimension to his and Bruce's relationship. This kind of makes Bane the fake Roz from Begins, except he's there the entire time, and of course, even when we find out that, like the Bane from Batman and Robin, he's subservient to a woman who wants to destroy Gotham and his primary function is planting bombs, he's more fleshed out than Ken Watanabe. But it makes things really awkward, because A, so much of what Bane says is null and void now, like his having been born in the darkness. Turns out he wasn't, unless his mother also gave birth to him in that prison. And B, we don't have enough time to really delve into their motivations, so Talia and Bane both come off as plot devices to manufacture conflict rather than people with real goals. It's not as bad as the last homicidal maniac bent on destroying a place with a weapon of mass destruction Tom Hardy played, but it's underdeveloped at best. Talia says her father excommunicated Bane for being a monster who only served to remind him of his wife, who took his place in the pit, and then she says, "I couldn't forgive him until you murdered him." That sounds like an easy, flimsy excuse for an elaborately planned, impossibly patient bad guy scheme, but I could maybe be led to believe it if we took the time to flesh it out and learn more about her relationship with her father. Just being a family is not enough. I'm not saying that just because she's mad at him for what happened to Bane, she wouldn't feel anything. But we have no idea what sort of relationship they had before the excommunication. Was she being trained to lead the League like Bruce was in Begins, and she left with Bane when he got excommunicated? We're just not told. And I'm confused as to what she cares about more, hurting Bruce or destroying Gotham. She says killing her father's murderer is just a reward for her patience, but everything about that plan revolves around Bruce, and that has to be totally intentional on her part. Right? She pretends to try to help Bruce get back in the world, pretends to try to help him save the world with the energy machine, pretends to maybe fall in love with him, and uses everything he had in trying to save Gotham to destroy it. I have a hard time believing this has more to do with finishing her father's work than it does hurting Bruce, especially since she makes such a big deal out of the slow knife thing. Heck, she's lucky she even gets a chance to give him that speech, since Bane didn't seem to think he'd ever get out of the pit and the bomb's about to go off, and it seems like that reveal would be a big part of her twisting the knife. I also don't understand why Bane goes against her wishes and tries to kill Bruce after she expressly tells him to keep him alive. "We both know I have to kill you now," Bane says. Why? What is your motivation apart from Talia? Are you just angry you didn't beat him and that he busted up your mask and humiliated you and made you feel all that pain, and that's more important than this woman you've been protecting and been loyal to all this time? I just don't know what his motivations are apart from Talia's. Not to mention all the other events that are pretty conveniently timed so Bruce is wherever Bane and Talia want him to be so you can experience maximum soul torture. And it's hard to buy they manipulate him in a way where they can be sure he'll do what they want him to do at every step, like going to Selina when he does so he can be lured to Bane, or showing her the energy machine when he does. She says he has no choice but to trust her, but how do they know he won't just flood it rather than take her to see it? And I have a hard time buying that he doesn't flood it a lot earlier, since he doesn't seem to think that they'll ever be able to use that machine without fear of somebody turning it into a bomb. Heck, how does Talia know Bruce won't contest all his assets being taken from him when it looks like he's foolishly thrown his money away on stock exchange futures? And why doesn't he challenge it? He wouldn't have to tell anyone about the fingerprint thing or risk anyone discovering he's Batman, I don't think, if he just said, "I didn't do that, and by the way, it's the only fishy thing that happened the day Bane and his crew broke into the stock exchange." Lucius says they might eventually be able to to prove fraud, but I think he'd have a reasonable chance of being believed since the timing is such a coincidence, even if he has had a history of making poor choices with money and living dangerously. But the original point, Talia and Bane make as many assumptions as Bruce does, and things work out for them because the movie needs a bad guy plot. It's a really weird plan, and I don't really understand how it gets started. Talia invested in the energy project in the first place, so she's looking for a way to destroy Gotham and decides to help Bruce with this energy project. Why? There's no way she could know that some scientist would write a paper after it was built on how to weaponize it. Is this one of those genius master plans that I'm supposed to buy was orchestrated all the way back from the very beginning? That Talia meant to help Bruce make a thing that could be turned into a bomb, and then she'd send Bane to get it and use it to create this fake revolution while Bruce watched in horror? This is a woman with an obscene amount of patience. What was she doing for the 5 years Bruce wasn't working on the fusion reactor, and what was she doing before that, right after Ra's got killed? Was she just waiting around, hoping for Bruce to build something she could potentially use to destroy Gotham? It's hard to believe she'd wait that long to try to destroy the city if that's all that matters to her, especially since she and Bane clearly have no intention on leaving, and the whole thing is a suicide mission. Oh. And why is it a suicide mission? Do they really think Gotham is still so corrupt that the entire League of Shadows should exist for this one mission, and once they blow it up, the world won't need them anymore? Like Bruce thought Gotham no longer needed Batman? Because, again, Ra's didn't exist solely to destroy Gotham. He was about restoring balance to the world at large. Bane says he is the League of Shadows, so I have to assume they're running it together, or he's pretending to be the face of it while she's pulling the strings like the fake Ra's and Ducard did. So really? That's it for the entire League of Shadows after this? Are they just both certifiably batty? And are the members now mercenaries, or are they still ninjas? Or are they both? They're referred to a lot as mercenaries, but at least some of them seem so loyal to Bane's cause they're willing to give their life for it too. So are those guys left over from the old League, or are they mercenaries Bane converted into loyal followers? They must think they're part of a real revolution, or that makes no kind of sense. Now, I want to take a step back and say that I'm not trying to make a laundry list of every little detail I don't like and say the movie's deeply flawed because of a lot of little unimportant incongruities. These are all symptoms of one big problem, and that's putting theme and plot over characterization. It's like a kid who cleans up his room, but he's really lazy about it. You take one glance at it and it looks pretty good, but open up that closet and everything comes pouring down on your head. The ideas the movie wants us to take away from it are flashed at us repeatedly in neon lights, and that heavy-handedness that started to rear its ugly head at the end of The Dark Knight is dialed up to 11. But a lot of the story stuff I need to believe what these characters are doing just isn't made explicit. This is not giving the audience credit and allowing us to piece the story together without being spoon-fed, I don't think. A lot of the pieces are simply missing. And this is also a movie with a lot more forced exposition and dialogue than these have ever had. My favorite is Daggett spelling out what the clean slate is to Selina, that's a little on the nose, who of course already knows what it does, and that was the price they agreed upon for her stealing Bruce's fingerprints for him. It comes too late, so I've been wondering what this mystery thing is she's after, waiting for it to naturally become clear so I can figure out what her motivations are, and when we finally get it, it's forced exposition they could have just given us way earlier. I think one of the people dealing with the difficulty of moving on in this story is Christopher Nolan himself. He conceived this movie as a definitive ending, I think at least partly so he wouldn't feel strong-armed by the studio to make more. It's tough being a proven director who can crank out movie after movie in the same franchise and make Warner Brothers a fortune when you have other projects of your own you want to do. I think Nolan sincerely saw a story here and a potentially great villain in Bane, and there's a lot of love and passion behind the camera. Or if there's not, he's so good at his job, he fakes it really well. So at the end of the movie, his Batman leaves Gotham, and Nolan has a torch lit, ready for the next Batman and John Blake to come along. Blake is younger, less hardened, perhaps more optimistic, and has a similar naivety to Bruce when he first came back to Gotham after his training. He has a different sort of training, and arguably not nearly enough yet, and he has a different skill set. It's the Dark Knight that's rising, implying that that symbol stands for the same basic ideas no matter who's in the costume, but more importantly, no matter what creative take on the character you're looking at. I think Nolan might be saying that there isn't one right way to do this character, and that whoever takes the reins after him, just like Blake reinventing this in-universe Batman, should do the character his own way. That's what made the series so successful in the first place. It was a bold and personal reimagining, not the definitive last word on the character. And although it's coming out of a Superman reboot that was co-written by Nolan himself, and that looks like an attempt to translate something akin to the style and attitude of these movies to Superman, because that was really popular, I hope that Zack Snyder is moving away from that with Batman vs. Superman, and that we'll have a new, fresh version that goes its own direction. This is the longest review I've ever written, and it could have been even a lot longer. One thing I'll give Rises is that it's incredibly ambitious in scope. There's a lot that doesn't work, but it's also pretty dense with material, and there's a lot more I could have talked about. Granted, some of that material, especially in a pretty slow first act that's all about seeing this master plan get started, I wish had been scrapped in favor of actually spending time in the no man's land and delving into the social aspects of that way of life. It's frustrating because I spent a lot of the movie imagining things that might have been more engaging and interesting than what ultimately amounts to another typical revenge plot and a bad guy trying to detonate a nuclear bomb. I'm not usually a big advocate for lengthy flashbacks, but I would have loved to see some of Raz's training Bane in parallel to Bruce's training in Begins, so we'd understand who Bane is. The contrast between the men would become more pronounced, and the history wouldn't feel like a throwaway device to contrive a scary bad guy. Plus, you got Liam Neeson here already, and he's just playing a hallucination, although who knows how many days he was available for and all that. I don't want to rewrite the movie, but it's hard to not want to see those things when they're introduced and not a lot is done with them. I'm giving The Dark Knight Rises a 2.5 out of 4, which may sound surprising given the backbreaker I just gave it. For this series, I think it's a massive drop down the pit, but compared to superhero movies at large, and even the action genre at large, it's above average. It's a technical tour de force, and there are a lot of wonderful moments and neat ideas at the conceptual level, but it's ultimately a failed souffle. It looks good when it goes in the oven, but unfortunately, it just never quite rises. Well, there you have it. I have finally scratched my way out of this mental pit I've been living in for almost 4 years. It was a long and painful journey, but I'm finally ready to move on and tackle something more straightforward, something less polarizing and controversial. Oh, son of a...
Weren't you the one who tried to break me with goodbye? Did you think I'd crumble? Did you think I'd lay down